The New York Times is in panic because they claim Trump's allies are archiving old posts from social media that they're going to use as weapons to humiliate their journalists, and they refuse to back down. Something interesting happened. The story came out the other day, and I was reading it, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about because the New York Times is not above journalism. Who do they think they are? If your staff posts things publicly, then they deserve an investigation on them as much as anyone. But the New York Times believes they're above everyone else, sitting atop an ivory tower, and they should not be subject to scrutiny. And that's what I thought. But in the end, I kind of felt like, well, I get it. The New York Times, they do this. They hire these people who say these things. There's a reason why I'm doing it today. Because the left and the right, and even Brian Stelter of CNN, are dragging the New York Times over their elitism. There's a viral post from Splinter News, which is woke, far left, dragging the New York Times, letting them know you are not above the act of journalism. And it's been a really bad past couple of weeks for the New York Times. They recently had one of their staff members outed by Breitbart as an anti-Semite. And then the guy went and started purging old tweets. They're now being dragged by the right for their past offensive employees. But together, the left and the right and even mainstream journalists are telling the New York Times, no, we have had it with your elitism. You're not special. You're not above us. And the New York Times put out two statements. First, a story. Trump allies target journalists over coverage deemed hostile to White House. Spare me your lies. This was a defense from one of the most prominent papers to make it seem like their journalists are only being scrutinized because they go after Trump. Sorry, that's not the case. I don't care who you are. If you're in a position to have an impact, we want to know what you're doing and why. No one is above this, not even me. You want to dig through my history, fine, whatever. We're all playing the same game. But take a look at this. The New York Times publishes this story where they're trying to frame it as though people are only going after him after the New York Times because they target the president. They even issued a special statement. Look at this. A campaign targeting our staff. A note to staff by New York Times publisher A.G. Sulzberger, calling attention to a Time story about a campaign led by President Trump's allies intended to harass and embarrass individuals affiliated with several leading news organizations. Oh, please. We see through you, New York Times. You are not special. You are human beings the same as everyone else. And if your staff want to post offensive, outrageous, and anti-Semitic posts, then you will be exposed the same as anyone else. Breitbart likes to point out that, in fact, the New York Times ran a story where they advised people how to go after Breitbart's business model. And they think they're special. And they think the rules don't apply to them. Let's read the first story from Legal Insurrection. I've got a lot to go through because it's not just this for the New York Times, but a leaked transcript as well showing their overt bias and how everyone has lost faith in them. The paper of record, the gray lady, as it were, I believe that's what they're calling it, is now, it's gone through a transformation where they hired woke regressive leftists, and you are going to reap what you have sown. So let's get started here. Before we do, make sure you head over to timcast.com/donate if you'd like to support my work. There's a PayPal option, a crypto option, a physical address, but the best thing you can do, share this video. YouTube is propping up corporate channels like CNN. Now, although we do have Brian Stelter of CNN also highlighting the New York Times' faults, it's still true that if I'm going to get a message out challenging the establishment and mainstream media, YouTube is holding me back, and I need your support. Share this video in order for more people to see this because YouTube used to recommend this kind of content. They're holding it back now. If you think my content is good by sharing it, you help me overcome that barrier. Let's read. Legal Insurrection writes, Trump supporters are quoting journalists' embarrassing social media statements, and the New York Times is furious. The Times will not be intimidated or silenced. Will Breitbart be? When you published an op-ed targeting them? I'm not saying you have to like Breitbart or agree with their opinion, but who is the New York Times to dictate who is or isn't a target of scrutiny and exposure? They say the call out and cancel cultures enabled by major media are out of control. Old tweets, sometimes from teenage years, are dug up and turned into media feeding frenzies. In December 2018, Robbie Sove at Reason reported, media attacks Heisman Trophy winner Kyler Murray for homophobic tweets he sent out as a 14-year-old. I kid you not. Well, guess what? That's the game you wanted to play. Now, they point out, the New York Post, the Daily Mail, Yahoo, and MSN, it's not unique to just the New York Times. This is a game played by the media. And now, what was it? Chickens have come to roost. The cows are coming home. You built this, and you will reap what you sow. Let's read on. Media amplification is critical. And in the age of Trump, old tweets are used to political effect, as this NBC News post shows how Donald Trump's old tweets haunt him today. The media has not been immune. When Sarah Jong was hired for the New York Times editorial board, a senior and influential position, her long string of racist tweets was exposed. Those tweets were not from her teenage years and were made just a few years ago, making them arguably more relevant given she was joining the editorial board of the most influential newspaper in the country and maybe the world. And their excuse? She was just using the language of her oppressors. Spare me the excuses. I don't care. I think the New York Times hired an overt racist, and they should be criticized for it. The New York Times is not happy that journalists are being subjected to such scrutiny by Trump supporters. In fact, the New York Times is furious. They reported this, which I've shown. They say that Trump allies targeting journalists, and they're trying to frame it as though it's only happening because the New York Times is going after Trump. I'm sorry. You're the paper of record. You've hired overt racists. You opened the door, and now the cows are coming home. That's what's going to happen. So they go on to show many of the statements from the Times, but they say, this is standard Oppo research stuff that politicians do against each other, and the media does with vigor. There is no claim that quotes are fabricated. They say, the New York Times, quoted, but the material publicized so far, while in some cases stripped of context or presented in misleading ways, has proved authentic, and much of it has been professionally harmful to its targets. And what do you think the New York Times does all day when they dig into people's pasts, when they investigate private citizens, when CNN wants to expose the identity of someone who posted some memes? You are not above any of it, New York Times, and you get what's coming to you. So they go on and they highlight a lot of people talking about this. But I want to show you the tweet from the New York Times. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and MSNBC analyst. A loose network of conservative operatives allied with the White House is pursuing what they call an aggressive operation to discredit news organizations deemed hostile to Trump by publicizing damage information about journalists. Is that what they're calling it? That it's just people allied with the White House? No, it's not allies of the White House. It's people who might like Trump, who might like the current, Republican government, but they're trying to make it seem as though these people have teamed up with the president. They haven't. I'd like to stress this point. Breitbart notes, in January 27, the Times published an op-ed by an author named Pagan Kennedy titled, How to Destroy the Business Model of Breitbart and Fake News. The article was a puff piece, boosting the efforts of sleeping giants, whose ringleader was later unmasked by the Daily Caller as advertising executive Matt Rivets. The piece even reprinted instructions for helping the boycott. It concluded admiringly, quote, a new consumer movement is rising, and activists believe that where votes failed, wallets may prevail. This struggle is much more than ads on Breitbart News. It's about using corporations as shields to protect vulnerable people from bullying and hate crimes. But here's where it gets interesting. I saw this story going around, but I was surprised to see Brian Stelter of CNN, of all people, posting this, because he just did a segment where he had a guy claim Trump was literally worse than some select historical figures, if you know what I'm trying to say. Some deplorable, disgusting historical figures. Journalism is not an identity. Journalism is an action. It is something you do. If you go out and gather true facts and write them in a true and readable way, you have done journalism. And it's a story from Splinter, which is really amazing because Splinter, as I mentioned earlier, is on the woke left. They write, many journalists are very indignant that Trump allies are reportedly combing through social media to identify embarrassing things they may have posted long ago that can be used to discredit them. In this case, I'm afraid, the outrage seems to be missing the point. What exactly is happening here? According to the New York Times, and they go over what we already said, they say it's people going after him. Lots of people who work with major media outlets. They plan to release these tidbits at politically advantageous times in order to discredit the employees and the media outlets themselves. This is all portrayed in formal and quite ominous language. There is a name for this that political reporters are familiar with: opposition research. But there is another name for this that is also accurate: media reporting, which is what Brian Stelter does. So it's surprising, again, that even though his show recently said Trump is mentally ill or something to that effect, he's going to stand up and say, sorry, New York Times, you're wrong, and people will come for you. Twitter is public. Journalists who work in the publishing business can hardly claim that it's unfair to publish things that they published. Laughing at bad tweets by New York Times reporters is a time-honored, and I would say honorable, activity. There is little meaningful difference between what this shadowy group of, quote, conservative operatives is doing and what media reporters at Gawker and the New York Observer did for many years, save for the motivation. The media reporters were mostly motivated by laughs and kicks and a belief in editorial transparency, whereas the conservatives are motivated by, a deep affinity for fascism. Sure. That's obviously over the top, but hey. Still, the actions themselves are basically the same. Social media is a powerful tool for making us all look like idiots. Twitter is a machine that allows you to show the entire world what a dumb A you are. I and every colleague I can think of who uses Twitter have made bad tweets that certainly make us look like idiots, because it is impossible to use Twitter for a long period of time without doing so. Most people in the world are at least part dumb A. Our tweets prove that. I do not think of this as a major crisis. So what is really at the heart of the respectable media's panicked and outraged reaction to news that right-wingers are searching their social media for things to troll them with? Well, clearly, the right-wingers can be expected to weaponize this information in bad faith, rather than saying, look at this bad tweet. They will be saying, the New York Times is not a credible news outlet because someone on its staff made this bad tweet, and therefore, you should disregard that huge feature on Trump's tax evasion and whatnot. Well, let me show you something. Here's a tweet from Alim Bakari. He is a reporter for Breitbart. He tweeted, in the past few years, the media has deployed its resources against anonymous Redditors. That's right, a guy who made a meme. A meme maker. Yes, other people like Carpe Donktum, I'm sorry. A forklift driver over a meme. Conservatives in tech. High school kids wearing MAGA hats. The same journalists who were okay with that are now mad because, quote, it's only okay when we do it. Alim says, the New York Times complains that investigating its journalists doesn't count as scrutinizing people in positions of power. People in positions of power like high school kids, forklift drivers, and random Reddit users. They say, the New York Times uses a straw man saying reporters are being investigated because of coverage critical of the president. No, it's because the media is happy to use its power against ordinary, private citizens who oppose its agenda. They aren't journalists anymore, they're inquisitors. And you know what? They get what's coming to them. Even Politico reporting. Journalists' old tweets are fair game for Trump. New York Times editors don't deserve special immunity from scrutiny for bigoted speech. Spot on. I got a couple more things I want to highlight. First, Michael Knowles tweeting this, an important point. Somewhere, there's a leftist whose job it is to watch and transcribe my show every single day in the hope that I say something that he might pretend gives offense so he can try to get me fired. That's what he does. That's his job, and that gives me joy. And he makes reference to Media Matters. And they do this. There is quite literally a nonprofit industry that targets conservative personalities to try and destroy them. And the New York Times are shocked that people have finally started climbing up their ivory tower and pointing the finger at them. The ivory tower of media is collapsing. It's been collapsing. And they are not immune. And they are going to get what's coming to them, because it's not just what we see from the left calling them out, but other stories. This one from the New York Post from a couple days ago. Bias has killed the Gray Lady, and Dean Baquet fired the fatal shot. Dean Baquet, he's in charge of the New York Times. We'll read through it and get his exact title. Bear with me. This is from Michael Goodwin of the New York Post writing. While reading the transcript of a New York Times staff meeting, a Lily Tomlin line came to mind. No matter how cynical you get, it is impossible to keep up. In this case, it is also impossible not to be disheartened and furious. The transcript shows that the rot of bias at the Times is far beyond the pale, and there is no hope of recovery. Before, they put out a statement saying, how dare you make fun of us? How dare you scrutinize us? this story was written. Why? Because in a transcript of a private meeting, we learned that they were targeting Trump specifically. Let's read on. He says, by giving reporters and editors license to try to stop Donald Trump from becoming president, then letting them peddle the Russia hoax, Baquet helped unleash the hatred that is tearing America apart. Never before has a single media institution played such a destructive role in the nation's life. But Baquet is not finished. The 75-minute meeting shows that he is now determined to destroy the president by painting him as an overt bigot. I can't say the R word because it's YouTube. Quote, I think that we've got to change, Baquet tells his assembled staff, after acknowledging the paper was a little tiny bit flat-footed when special counsel Robert Mueller performed so poorly before Congress. In other words, Baquet had swallowed hook, line, and sinker Hillary Clinton's fiction that Trump conspired with Putin to steal the election. Then again, this is the same editor whose paper was certain Clinton would win in 2016. Quite a track record. Which leads to Baquet's newest idea for stopping Trump. How do we cover a guy who makes these kind of remarks? How do we cover the world's reaction to him? How do we cover America that's become so divided by Donald Trump? You mean by you. You're the media. You are feeding this. How do we write about race in a thoughtful way, something we haven't done in a long time? That, to me, is the vision for coverage for the rest of the next 2 years. New York Post writes, this isn't journalism. It's political activism, aligned with the talking points of Democrats. And to liken race relations today to those in the 1960s, as Baquet does, is beyond ignorant. So here we are. Here we are with multiple stories and people pointing out this is what the media does. They don't realize they're playing the game. Listen, I fully understand. I'm a journalist and political commentator, and I give my opinion, and I'm saying things now, pointing a finger at the media, saying we are all playing the same game. I get it. The issue is when the New York Times acts like they're above us. You're not. If they're going to come after anyone, don't be surprised when they come after you. Yashir Ali of New York Magazine and HuffPost says, folks, I'm not breaking any news here, but it's been a rough 2 months for the New York Times. Before you say it's been a rough few years, I mean it's worse than it's ever been. I feel bad for all the hardworking reporters and its editors. Let me make it clear. This is not one scandal. This is multiple scandals. First, we have this story, which is the main story of today, that the New York Times thinks they're better than you. They think they are better than you, and they're not. We have this story from the New York Post, the second scandal, a leaked transcript showing that they are playing politics on purpose. As we learned the other day in one of my segments, these woke leftists, these anti-Trump personalities, know they're doing it for money. They say it as much in their own statement. This woman wrote that they're doing what they're doing with woke politics for a sports website, nonetheless, writing about politics on a sports website because it's better, because it gets more clicks, it drives more traffic. But you're a sports website, write about sports. The New York Times should be writing fairly and honestly about everything. They don't. They took a political position, and the leaks have come out. And then we have this other story, which is just from, what's the date on this one? August 22nd. Crap, I can't even repeat what this guy said. New York Times editors, anti-Semitism and racism has been exposed. And there it is. This story is not the only one that's going to come out. We know that the New York Times is willing to hire overt racists, and they think they're shocked when people come out and highlight it. Yashir Ali is right. He's completely right. It's been a bad past couple of months. It's been a bad past couple of years. But I want to make one big point about the media. They have always viewed themselves as above you. We've seen statements. There's a clip from MSNBC where Michael Brzezinski says something to the effect that it's their job to tell people what to think. Sorry. It's the job of individuals to educate themselves to the best of their abilities. I understand. Not everyone can. And unfortunately, there is a large group of people in this country that believe fake news and nonsense. You can look at what Snopes puts out in their fight with Babylon Bee. If you're not familiar, Babylon Bee is a satire site. And Snopes keeps fact-checking them as if it's real news. It's not. It's a joke, and everyone knows it. But this is part of the game. The New York Times will send its journalists to dig up dirt on many people. They will run pieces advocating for the destruction of a rival company. And then they think they're better than you, and you shouldn't go after them? I will say this. I wouldn't be surprised if following this story, what do we see? Way more people going after the New York Times. Way more people digging up tweets and digging into everything they've ever posted. Not because they're allied with Trump. I certainly am not. But I'll tell you this. I criticize the New York Times for two big reasons. First, they're hiring racists, and you've heard me say it. But second, they ran a front page fake news conspiracy. You've done this to yourself. You have fallen from the ivory tower a long time ago. You're now sitting in the weeds, looking around, acting like you're more important than anyone else when you are not. You're the same. Fake news conspiracy theories because you just want clicks. The same as Deadspin wrote in their war with their new boss. They don't care about real news and being honest. I'll give credit to the New York Times for calling out the fake news about the Amazon, saying these fires happens every year. The fires in the Amazon happen every year, and it was worse in years past, and it was way worse 10 years ago. It's fair to point out the New York Times does some good journalism. But the snooty arrogance, this belief that they're better than us, is everything I have always hated. And this is the biggest problem the Democrats have always had. People like Bill Maher, who I can get behind when he calls out the woke progressive left, but not when he calls for a recession. It shows you what they really believe. They're on the left because they believe they're morally superior to everyone else, and they will flaunt it above you with not only a story trying to reframe what's actually going on, but a public statement saying we're being targeted. It's a harassment campaign. Spare me. They just wrote I believe they wrote 5 op-eds about Gamergate. You're playing the game? You want to support one half of the culture war? Well, congratulations. You are in it. And now they're coming for you the same as anybody else. I'll leave it there. You get the point. I hate the elitists. Stick around. Next segment will be coming up at youtube.com/timcastnews at 6 p.m. It is a different channel. I will see you all there.